Now the master and the monarch, being of the same mind, looked with sadness at the 18 returns to life, the best and the longest, as well as the worst and the shortest. But the Dharma treasures of the 5 times 5 perfections are rich, and the base and root of these treasures is wide. Treasure of the ancestors, treasure of the descendants, treasure of the masters, arch treasure, sealed treasure, sealed hiding places, sealed secrets, profound sealed shelters of the treasures. Sealed treasures, their revealers are perfect. And King Trusung Detsen requested of Padmasambhava, the second Buddha, when will these treasures come to light? What will be the names of the revealers? And the great master Padma replied, the masters of the holy Dharma will awaken the work of the past, and when they lack leaders, the revealers of treasures will appear. Sometimes they will bring to light great treasure, sometimes small. Now an extraordinary treasure and a secret treasure, a spiritual treasure, a subtle treasure. And when treasures do not come forth, they will guard the axioms of the former treasures. Of the history unabridged of the lives of the Guru of Udayana, Padmasambhava, this is the 92nd canto, the signs of the earth and the times when treasures will appear, sealed oaths. So these treasure revealers are the Tertöns. And the first time I ever heard this term or knew anything about such a thing was when I heard Sangharakshita give his Padmasambhava Day talk in 1979, which Lokeshvara mentioned last night in the introduction and welcome. So I was at the LBC, and I know that quite a few people in this room would have been at that talk. I can see a few nods around the room. It was 1979. The LBC hadn't been very long opened. We were all packed, tons of people packed into the main shrine room at the LBC. And in my memory, Bhante gave this talk without notes. I'm not sure if that's true, but in my memory, he's just standing, you know the way he does sometimes with his hands behind his back, and he just kind of holds forth. He must have had a copy of the Life in Liberation there, because there's huge long quotes from the Life in Liberation. I can't imagine that was done from memory. But my memory is that the talk itself was really quite a spontaneous uttering of something. And it really was something. It was an extraordinary experience. I was a mitra. I'd been around the movement for 2 years, just under 2 years. I'd moved into London. I had heard Bhante give other talks. I'd been at a couple of series of talks that he gave. But there was something about this talk which was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. And I have experienced it since in some of Bhante's talks, but there was just a magic there. And it really, really felt to me, and I know that others have said the same thing to me, it really felt like Padmasambhava was in that room. It really felt that what Bhante was talking about was very directly coming from somewhere beyond just this, whatever he was then, 50-year-old man, whatever. It's 40 years ago, so just talking about Padmasambhava. So in that talk, he talks about 4 archetypes. And they're the Manu, the Buddha, the Guru, and the Tertön. So I'm mainly in this talk looking at the Guru and the Tertön. But just for the sake of completeness, I'll just say a little bit about the Manu and the Buddha. So the Manu is the primeval lawgiver. And I do know and I acknowledge that this is a problematic term for some of our Indian brothers and sisters because of it being related to the Hindu law. And you might recall that one of the actions of Dr. Ambedkar was to burn the Manusmriti in 1927. I don't mean you'll recall it as having been there, but you might recall having heard that. And so obviously the Manu is a problematic term. In this talk, this is how Bhante describes that concept, or that archetype, better said. When the human race reappears, there reappears with the human race, at the very dawn of what we might call history, a great lawgiver who lays down the basis of society, and he is called the Manu. Humanity needs society. Humanity needs social organisation. But that social organisation must be on the basis not of social, but of moral, ethical, and ultimately spiritual principles. In other words, the whole of social life in all its aspects must be so organised as to make the spiritual life possible, even to prepare people for the spiritual life. So this is the function of the Manu. He creates a stability, or she creates a stability, they create a stability in which something of the Dharma can begin to flourish. That the Dharma can't flourish in conditions of chaos and instability. Which is kind of interesting, thinking about our own times. And Bhante, I think in that talk, or possibly elsewhere, he comments on how we, in terms of our movement, our community, we can think of the Manu as the positive group, the kind of community that surrounds our order, and that there needs to be stability within that. I mean, even on a very practical level, for somebody to enter the order, they need to have stability, and it's important that there's stability around them to support that. But of course, it's also in a much more broad, a much more social, even cosmic scale. And then the Buddha. Well, I probably don't need to say very much about the Buddha to this particular group of people. But just to say a little bit about what Bhante says in this talk. He says, Shakyamuni, the Buddha, had time to proclaim the teaching only in a very general way. That's to say, if one considers humanity or even the cosmos as a whole, his teaching he addressed his teaching mainly to the conscious, rational part of humanity. So a lot must happen after his death. In the case of the Buddha, after his parinirvana, he's made a good start. He's touched the comparatively more superficial levels. That is to say, so far as the mass of humanity is concerned. So it's not suggesting that the Buddha's teaching is superficial, but the ability for that to spread in the lifetime of 35 years would have been very limited. And Bhante goes on to say, the deeper, even psychic levels on a mass scale have not yet been touched. So that's quite interesting. What I take from that is that even for ourselves, what we get in terms of our teaching of the Buddha, in terms of the Dharma, will create conditions for change, but it might be that also we need to engage deeper levels of ourselves, and that we need to find a way to integrate what we might call the shadow side of ourselves, what we might call those deeper, more chaotic energies of ourselves. So I think in that talk, Bhante does say something like the Buddha stirred up the psychic forces of the world. It's quite an interesting thought. And then the second Buddha, or the Guru, in our case Padmasambhava, in this case Padmasambhava, is the one who comes along to work with those energies once they've actually been aroused. So Bhante says, for us, Padmasambhava is the one who subdues the demons. This is his principal work. So there's a lot of talk in this talk about demons. There's a huge bit in it where Bhante describes in graphic detail the story of Tharpanagpur, who's one of the demons, one of the monsters that you find in the life and liberation of Padmasambhava. And Bhante describes it with great relish, actually. There's quite a lot of descriptions about vomits and, kind of boils and pus and things like that. And he just seems to quite enjoy himself relating this story. I really recommend listening to this talk if you've never heard it, because there's something you can feel. He's quite playful in it, and you get a little bit of a sense of people in the room kind of responding to that. Unfortunately, of course, we didn't have clear vision there to record them on video, so it's only an audio. Anyway, he talks a lot about demons. He says, who are these demons? They're not just mythological figures. They're forces within the human mind itself. They exist at a very deep level, not only in the individual mind, but where the individual mind ends and the collective mind begins, which is an interesting idea that the sort of individual mind in a way spreads into, in some way interrelates with something that's more collective, something that's more, even unconscious. And he says these forces need to influence and affect the conscious mind, especially until such time as the mind has attained a level of superconsciousness. So in a sense, if we think that part of our path in a way is to try and integrate ourselves to the extent that we've gone beyond kind of divisions in ourselves, that we're actually, in a way, we've even gone beyond the fact that we believe in the self, that we're able to sort of exist, we're able to be part of the great flow of everything, part of the flow that arises and passes, then to get to that point, we often have to make sure that we're not leaving huge bits of ourselves behind. Yeah. So Bhante says these forces have to be tackled if there's to be a thoroughgoing transformation, and this is what Padmasambhava does. So he talks quite a lot in this talk, not only of trying to do that in one's own life and practice, but the need for that to happen at a societal level. And I'll come back to that later on in the talk. But what about the Tertön? So we've had the Manu, the Buddha, the Guru, Padmasambhava, needing to come and work with these energies that have been unleashed. So the Tertön, well, what does the Tertön do? Well, the Tertön is the revealer that I read from the Life and Liberation. He or she is the revealer of the Dharmas. It's a Tibetan word, unlike the others, which is Sanskrit. And the Tertön means the taker out of treasure, or the finder of treasure. So the treasure is what's hidden, and the ter is the treasure that's been hidden, and tön is the way that it's taken. It's the treasure finder who comes and releases that treasure. So the treasure has been hidden, and the revealer's part in the archetypal cosmic myth is to re-reveal, to find that treasure and reveal it. So Padmasambhava, it seems, foresaw a time when other teachings would be needed, which if he'd given at that point when he was teaching, they might have been misunderstood, they might have been misapplied, or they might have been lost. So the story tells us, the Tibetan tradition tells us that he buried these treasures in all sorts of different places so that in the right moment they could be found, they could be revealed, and they could give whatever was needed to humanity in that moment. So he's hidden away all these treasures, and Bhante says in the Padmasambhava Day talk, he says, this shows us that even Padmasambhava cannot do all the work. The Buddha proclaims the teaching in a general way. Padmasambhava will cause it to penetrate into the depths of your psyche, cause it to transform the archetypes of the collective unconscious. But even he can't do it all once and for all. Situations change, circumstances change, teachings need to be adapted. So adapters are needed, new versions are needed, adapted to the particular and specific conditions. And this is what a Dharma represents. The transforming principle, as it were, adapted to very specific, concrete circumstances in the here and now. I was so excited when I heard that. I just sort of felt, wow, that's an extraordinary project to be part of. And he finishes that bit by saying, and this is, I think this could almost be a manifesto. I know there is a Buddhist manifesto already, but this could be the pithy manifesto for us. The application of the transforming principle to particular circumstances, specific conditions here and now, at present, inspirations which come to us in the present for our present guidance, in accordance with the general principles of the teaching both in its visionary and its transforming aspects. I'm going to read that again because it's, as usual, in Bhante's pretty dense sentences. So I'll read it again. The application of the transforming principle to particular circumstances, conditions here and now at present, inspirations that come to us in the present for guidance, and they have to come in accordance with the general principles of the teaching, both in its visionary and its transforming aspects. And actually, I think that's a very good description of what Bhante's done. I think it's a really good description of what our order and our community attempts to do, is stay very, very true to the deep principles of the Dharma, be really true to the essential nature of the Dharma and in its visionary aspect, but also in a way that's applicable. I mean, that's what Bhante said when he set up the then FWBO, WBO. He wanted it to be the Dharma applicable to people living in modern conditions, in a post-industrial society, a post-modernist society, a society where the conditions seem very different from the conditions of the past, but staying very true to those essential teachings. So I do feel we've been given, to some extent, a terma in our community, in our order. So that talk for me was one of those milestone talks which I sat and listened to, and I just felt this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. And but it wasn't the first that I'd heard that made me feel like that. So I came along to the Glasgow Buddhist Centre in 1977. I walked through the door of the Glasgow Buddhist Centre. I was in a terrible state. I was really not in good nick at all. And I was really looking for something. And I had been looking for something for quite a long time. And the talks that I came into were the series called Buddhism for Today and Tomorrow. Again, life-changing and extraordinary talks. They were talks Bhante had given the year before, 1976, in Brighton. So they used to always be called the Brighton Talks. I don't know if they still are. And he talks about the building of a new society and the transformation of self and world in that. And I had been somebody who had really wanted to change the world on a kind of political level, but had had the realisation that I was in no state to change anything. I often say this, I couldn't even change my library books in time. So I was really not in the business of being able to completely transform the world around me. And I had realised that. But I wasn't particularly interested in self-development. In fact, I was totally uninterested in self-development. So when I saw a poster that advertised these talks, Buddhism for Today and Tomorrow, it said something like, change your mind, change the world. I thought, okay, I'll go and have a listen to that. So I went along to the Glasgow Buddhist Centre and heard the second of those talks. Interestingly, I missed the first, which is a method of personal development. So that was actually coincidental. It was because I only saw the poster the second week, honest. So, and in these three talks that I then heard over the next 3 weeks, Bhante talks about the creation of a new society, and that one doesn't just transform self for the sake of having a better life, but that one transforms self in relationship to transformation of the world. So it's what I had been looking for. Honestly, I felt so like a person in the desert that had been seeking water. And I felt I was given a great big pitcher of ice cold water with ice cubes in it. And I'd been seeking it in all sorts of ways. I mean, on a personal level, I'd been on my drug quest for seeking higher states of consciousness. I definitely had altered states of consciousness. Whether I could call them higher is really quite debatable. Actually, they weren't. And I was also looking for methods in the political world, in the more social world. I could see around me that there was a need for the world to be transformed. I think I was very, very aware of suffering. I was very aware of suffering in my own life, that I hadn't had that easy a time at parts of my life. I was aware of suffering around me in the community that I grew up in, the community that I lived in, which was a community with a lot of poverty and quite a lot of violence, actually. So I was very aware of the need for that to be changed and transformed. And I was very aware of the suffering on a sort of bigger scale. and what seemed to me to be the injustices that I could see all around me. And I'd really looked in all the political kind of possibilities that I could think of. I started in the Communist Party and went further left. I tried anarchy, but I couldn't find any meetings. You know, I really was looking for some answer to these existential questions. And I felt as I sat in that room in the Glasgow Buddhist Centre in Heruka, as it was then, it was a men's community with a centre kind of attached. And I just felt when I sat there, this is it, where do I sign up, you know? And I have never felt any different. I mean, I've had moments of thinking, God, what did I do? Or why am I with this lot? But I've never doubted the Dharma, and I've never doubted that actually, even with all our faults and ups and downs, we've got something to offer the world in Sri Ratna. So when I heard this talk of Bhante's in 1979, and he promised that these treasures appeared in the world in the days that they were necessary, I thought, can we have some? We need them. We need them now. So that was 1979. I don't think we need them any less in 2018. Sealed aims. Until the times of coming forth are perfect, signs of the earth, which is trembling, decadence and disgust, wars born of hate, famines proceeding from desire, epidemics caused by error. Sealed aim. May a revealer bring the treasure to light. It is the Dharma, magic. It is the central treasure, the southern and the northern ones, those of the east and those of the west. So that's also from Canto 92 of the Life and Liberation. And I think the times we live in need the Dharma to be revealed, to be cherished, to be upheld, to be lived. So going back to that talk of Bhante's in 1979, I've got another quite long quote. Actually, this talk, it's transcribed. You can find it in Free Buddhist Audio as a text as well, if you want to kind of look up some of these quotes. So Bhante's talking about the demons. We're back with the demons. And he says, I remember in this connection, a few years ago, a friend was driving me through the city of London. When I say the city, I mean the city with a capital C, where the stock exchange is and where the banks are. And I looked from side to side, skyscraper to the right, skyscraper to the left, bank to the right, bank to the left. All these big ponderous buildings connected with money, with finance, high finance, connected with a certain kind of power. And I said to this friend, this is what we're up against. This is one of the demons. Money, this sort of power related to high finance is out of control. It's out of control of the spiritual principle. So there are economic demons, there are social demons, sociological demons, political demons, even perhaps religious demons. We mustn't think of these as sort of mythological that you can just read about in a fairy story. All very nice, but you'll never meet one. You're meeting demons all the time of one kind or another. You're living in a world of demons. So they're quite long quotes, but when I was thinking of this talk, I thought, well, I can't say it any better. So I decided I would just share quite long quotes. So again, when I heard that, of course it appealed to the old commie in me. And of course that was conditioned. It was as conditioned as any other response. And it was, no more spiritual than any other response might be. But I did feel that what Bhante was pointing at was the spiritual issues and the spiritual problems that there are with certain aspects of our society. So he wasn't giving a political analysis of high finance or a political analysis of capital. But he was saying that when these things are put to the service of greed, hatred and delusion, then they become demonic. They are the demons that we're living with. They're the demons that we're facing. But he doesn't say in that talk, so get yourself away from these, run away. Don't have anything to do with money. Don't have anything to do with society. Shut yourself up in a monastery somewhere. No, not at all. He talks about the need to go right into the belly of the beast, as it were. So going back to this monster, or this demon that he described to us, Tarpanagpur, he says, in the top band, he says, so the Dharmas are located in the body of Tarpanagpur. They're hidden away in caves, yes, they're hidden away in stones, but really they're hidden in the body of Tarpanagpur. There's one treasure hidden in his kidneys and another in his veins. There's one in his lungs and another in the foot. They're all hidden. What does this mean? Well, if we look carefully, you find the remedy where you find the disease. The remedy's found in the depths of the disease. If you plunge deeply into the body, so to speak, of Tarpanagpur, you can find and take out the treasure. You don't have to go outside the world to find the transcendental. You go very deeply into it. You utilize it. You utilize the forces and the energies. This Tarpanagpur is also called Mataranga, which means the consumer of his mother. It's kind of interesting that he consumed what had given birth to him, which is so very much what we do in some ways. We consume what's beautiful sometimes. We see things in terms of consumption. That's how we, it's very much how humanity sees the resources at our disposal, is as resources at our disposal, rather than part of a living, breathing ecosystem. Anyway, so what is the Dharmic response to this? What is the Dharmic response? What does it actually mean to go into the heart of the beast, the belly of the beast? What does it mean? Well, I think it means practicing the Dharma. I think that's the very first thing it means, is just on our own, in our own individual case, what do we need to do to really not be participating in those demonic forces? How do we take ourselves seriously enough to take ourselves out of participation in the worst of those demonic forces? It's also very important to understand conditionality and understand it very deeply, in the sense that we're actually part of the conditions of the world. So it's not like we're separate from dark salvation and we're kind of somehow on a nice pink cloud meditating and just being all Dhyanic and all lovely and everything. I mean, maybe some of you are. It's not my own experience of how the spiritual life has worked itself out in the last 40 years. There've been moments. But in a way, it's like everything that we do, we're not apart from that. We're not apart from samsara. We are part of samsara. So we need to find ways of working where we lessen that, and where we put our grain of sand, as it were, in the part of the scale that's nirvanic, that's transcendent, that's good. So that's one thing we can do. Really see that every action that we do has consequences, and that our practice doesn't just happen sitting in a cushion. Our practice is about our lives and how we live our lives. I found an article by Bhikkhu Bodhi. He wrote, it's quite a long time ago, although I only found it a year or so ago. He wrote it in 2011, and it's called What Kind of World Do We Want? It was in Lion's Roar originally, a magazine. And he's talking about the need to respond to the troubles of the world, and he says, it doesn't suffice merely to adopt Buddhist teachings as a route to deep self-fulfillment. A predominantly personal approach to spiritual growth falls short of Buddhism's ethical ideals and misses half the message. Greed, hatred and delusion are not only in our mind, they're in the food we eat, the gas we put in our cars, and the movies we turn to for entertainment. So I really like the way he put that. They're in everything. They're in what we purchase, where we go, how we travel, who we mix with, how we spend our money, how we spend our lives. He goes on to say, the Buddha taught the Dharma on the basis of a far-reaching vision that pierced the depths of suffering in both its personal and collective dimensions. He offered this teaching not only as a method to tame the world, but as a standard for ennobling us in all dimensions of our being, including the social, political and economic. His discourses on lay ethics, communal harmony and even the duties of the king are testimony to this panoramic awareness. So I agree with Bhikkhu Bodhi in this. I think everything we do has its effect. Now, I'm not by that suggesting that we all need to take up political banners and go to the, back to the barricades. Because I also think that the creation of monastic situations is an equally radical act. Maybe even more radical act. But I do believe that we need both. We need people who are contemplative. If this was a Catholic audience, I could say we need both the apostolic and the contemplative. So the apostolic's out there teaching and converting. So that's the Jesuits, for example. The Benedictines are the more contemplatives. I'd like to see our order having a bit more Benedictine and possibly a bit more, maybe not a bit more Jesuit, but a bit more apostolic. So I think I agree with Bhikkhu Bodhi that we're not practicing the Dharma just to make our lives more palatable. I mean, it's great if they do become more palatable, and one would hope that as one breaks through the self-clinging, breaks through ego, life would become simpler and more easy and more straightforward. But I don't think it can stop there. I think we also have a duty of care to the world around us, which people will take up in different ways. But one thing I think we need to be really vigilant for, both in our own practice and in terms of our community, is the contamination by worldly values. It's very, very easy for the world to impinge. We're quite a small and fragile community in some ways. We've got a lot of strength, but we're trying to practice a different way of life in the face of quite strong forces to the contrary. So really being aware and vigilant in how those forces can sometimes impinge and enter not only our own hearts and minds, but our community. Greed, hatred and delusion are still as strong as ever. And David Loy, who I like his writing in Money, Sex, War, Karma, talks about these three poisons becoming institutionalized. That our economic systems institutionalize greed, militarism institutionalizes hatred, and interestingly, and he wrote this quite a long time ago, actually in the early noughties, I think. He says that corporate media institutionalizes delusion. I think that's become very apparent in recent years, and how much the corporate media is actually basically in the service of big business. It's in the service of corporate finance. And I told myself when I was doing this talk I wasn't going to get political. So I won't read my quote from Chomsky. However, I think we can all say, whatever our political colour is, we can see that the world around us is suffering, that there is suffering in the world around us. Another quote from David Loy from an article he wrote in 2011 was, he talked about the relationship between the economic power in the world and the political spheres, particularly in North America and the USA, and how it was becoming very difficult to differentiate between business and government. I think the election in 2016 completely vindicated that comment. There's a CEO running one of the biggest and most powerful nations in the world, and it really does feel like it's corporately run. That's the political bit. I'm going to stop now. Except to say, that I don't think these problems are just in the USA. I mean, all around us, we're in a complex world. We can't always tell the conditions that are at play in any particular phenomenon. We can't always look at something and say it's bad, or look at something else and say it's good. Things are often much, much more complex, complicated and subtle than that. So I think also we need to learn to really see the forces of greed, hatred and delusion when they're playing themselves out in our own lives and when they're playing themselves out around us. Because I do believe that many of these questions are not political, but they're moral and ethical questions, how we respond to the suffering of the world. It doesn't matter the colour of your political kind of beliefs. The question is, how do we create a world that's not so bewitched by the demons, that's not so caught up in the demonic forces? How can we as Buddhists, individually and as a community, be a force for good in an obviously suffering world? Well, I think one thing we can do is look the demons in the eye. You know, again, not to be scared and run away from the things that we find difficult in the world, but be willing to somehow engage, be willing to actually go in there. Because, but look the demons in the eye, but don't demonize the people with the eyes, if you see what I mean. It's very easy, and I do it myself. I know how easy it is to demonize the people who seem to me to be living the kind of life that seem to me to be those demonic forces at play. And of course, that's no, we know that hatred never ceases with hatred. Only love can go beyond that. Only the bodhicitta can actually go beyond the polarity of good and evil. Only really serving and being part of that bodhicitta force is what's going to allow us to be that force for good in a very, very polarized world. And I think what we also have to offer, maybe the main thing we have to offer as practitioners are our values and our principles. We can be a fourth sight for people. People are looking for something. People, of course, we're all caught up in those sort of forces, but many, many, many people around are looking for a way out of that. And we can offer something of that. We can show that there are alternatives, that there are alternative ways of living and working together, and that those alternative ways do work against the forces of greed, hatred, and delusion. It's not to say that they're perfect or they're always going to be easy. I reread Vadika's book recently, The Buddha on Wall Street. And there's a whole chapter in it, a whole bit in it where he's talking about the 3 C's, the new society, and how that had been what had propelled him very much into Triratna. And there was the same for me, that teaching of the 3 C's, the centre, community and co-ops. I just thought it's a whole complete way of life and I want it. This is the kind of life I want. And actually I ended up in tears reading this chapter in Vadika's book. I felt so sad that we don't have quite the same possibilities to offer people in those particular ways. And it was particularly reading about Windhorse, because when Vadika had written his book, Windhorse was still functioning, and he talks about it in such extraordinary terms, about what a radical lifestyle it is. And I just could feel myself, I just cried actually when I read it. And it's not that I think we should go back and everything should, and they were all better then, and we need to kind of reproduce exactly the same things as we had in 1970 something or 1980 or 1990 or whenever. The Tertöns need to be relevant for today. So the treasures that we can offer the world need to be treasures that are applicable in the world that we live in. That doesn't mean that they need to be compromised by the world that we live in. On the contrary, they need to be even less compromised than they've been. So I'm not suggesting, as I say, we suddenly have exactly all the same structures as we had, but I'm very pleased to see that residential communities seem to be forming again in some places, and more people are asking to move into them. So I think new models will emerge. I'm confident that new models will emerge, but they will only emerge and be applicable if they're emerged in terms of the principles that were there at the bottom of that idea of a new society, of cooperation, of community, of going beyond the individual and working together towards a bigger project. Our principles, our precepts can change minds and hearts. They can change actions, not just for us practicing them, but in terms of how we practice them in relationship to others. All of our precepts are about principles, whether it's the principle of non-violence, of generosity, of contentment, of truthful, kindly, etc. speech, the principle of really, really working with our mental states to overcome ego clinging. All those principles will need to find new forms again and again, and in a way that's part of our task, is to find what the tertons would be, what forms are applicable now. And I really do think we can take this seriously. Another talk that was a life-changing talk for me, or one that I really totally related to, was Evolution or Extinction, a Buddhist view of current world issues or world problems, also from the 70s. And in that, Bhante talks about the need for new things to emerge. And he says, he talks about how do we respond to these incredible crises that we see around us in the world. And he relates a number of crises that he sees at that time, including the ecological crisis, economic, ecological, social, poverty, wars. And he says at the end, he offers 4 things that the contemporary Buddhist can do to really work. You'd probably be very familiar with this, I would imagine, but just to remind you in case you know. He talks about the need to find a method of personal development, because otherwise we'll be part of the problem rather than part of the solution. He talks about finding a community or creating community of people who will support the values of being a true individual, people that will support the values that we can see really are needed in society and in the world today. And in that, he says, it doesn't just mean our community as a kind of closed community, but he talks about like-minded communities and the need to kind of be in relationship with them. He then talks about withdrawing our energy from the forces that work against our principles and our values. And lastly, where we can't withdraw, influence. And I think those last 2 are really what I'm talking about. When I say I don't think it's political, I think it's moral or ethical. To withdraw our energy and our money and all those other things from the forces that we see as actually shoring up what works against our values as individuals, what works against kindness and compassion and love and cherishing each other. That's beginning to sound slightly like a song. And really just take those seriously. You know, where can we withdraw our energy? And where we can't withdraw, influence. Be Buddhists. That might seem like a really strange thing to say. But, you know, I remind myself as well at times, I'm a 4th sight. People know I'm a Buddhist. People outside this order and movement who know me know I'm a Buddhist. They look at how I live my life. They're curious. They're going to be critical. I'm sure some of you at least have had family members say to you, oh, don't think that's very Buddhist, when you've lost your temper slightly or you whatever your particular thing is. So be willing to, that's okay. We'll just be willing to say, well, I'm a Buddhist and I'm practicing. You know, that might not have been so good, but I really take this seriously. And really speak out where we see things that do work against the good. You know, as long as it's safe, be willing to tackle what we see as those demonic forces. This talk was called The Gift That Keeps On Giving. Well, of course, what is that gift? It's the Dharma. The Dharma is the gift that keeps on giving. It never ends, it never stops. And the more we give of it, the more we have in our hearts. Sealed hiding places. The holy and perfect Dharma commands through its winning doctrines, achieves through its noble counsel, pleases by its justice. Until the times of coming forth are perfect, signs of the earth which is trembling, decadence and disgust, wars born of hate, famines proceeding from desire, epidemics caused by error. Sealed aim, may a revealer bring the treasures to light. It is the Dharmic, its magic. It is the central treasure, the southern and the northern, those of the east and the west. So we've all been given the gift of the Dharma. Let's pass it on, let's give it away. It's a gift that will keep on giving. To the extent that we give it, we'll gain. Bring those values into the world. Reveal the treasures. We need to be the Tertöns. That's what the world needs now. We've got the treasure. We've had, well, we don't exclusively have it, there is treasure to be got, but we have been given such a treasure. There's been 50 years of this treasure already in the world in terms of the order. Let's aim for 50 more, for 500 more, for 5,000 more, for kalpas more. Let it never end. Let the Dharma never diminish. But we do need Padmasambhava's help. Padmasambhava, we must remember, is born of love. His father is Amitabha. When he is born in the lake of Dhanakosha, he comes from the heart of Amitabha. And also through Avalokiteshvara, the symbol of our order. I asked Bhante about this last year. I was suggesting that maybe Padmasambhava could become the new symbol of the order, which was slightly cheeky. But I was something in what I was trying to say. And he said, well, we don't need a new symbol for the order. Of course, we don't. He said, don't forget that Padmasambhava is the Nirmanakaya version of Avalokiteshvara, who's the Sambhogakaya version of the Dharmakaya as seen in Amitabha. So all three of them are there within our order, and I'm delighted that we have them all here in this amazing shrine. So Avalokiteshvara is our symbol of the order, is what's needed in the world. The values that we can offer, the precepts that we can practice and offer around us. And we need the energy. When I saw Bhante just a few days ago, I was telling him I was asking me about the order weekend, and I was telling him it was about Padmasambhava, which he was very pleased to hear. And he said, well, why you need Padmasambhava is you need the energy to keep going. Because when times get tough, it's hard to keep going, and that's when it's easy to slide into just seeing the Dharma in much more small and limited terms. So Canto 103, some of you will know it well, the advice to the three fortunate women and departure. It ends by saying, even unto poverty, misery and death, contemplate the great perfection. Do not fail to call upon me. Do not despair. So I'd like to end this talk by asking you to join me in calling upon the forces of Padmasambhava, that he may be amongst us and help us to be a force for good in a troubled, distressing and painful world. Om Ahung Jetsan Guru Padma Siddhi Hung. Om Ahung Jetsan Guru Padma Siddhi Hung. Om